Thank you very much. It's a tremendous honor to be here. I want to apologize, first of all, for my voice, which I seem to be losing. It's contracting faster than world trade. But the fact that there's a time limit is probably good because there's probably a limit to how much I can speak. This, you may not recognize or know, is a historic day. Not today, this year, but 52 years ago, marked an important milestone and threshold that was met here in Korea and was important for the world economy as well. In 1964, on this day, President Park announced that exports of Korea had exceeded for the first time $100 million and declared this to be Export Day, which several years later was changed to be Trade Day, acknowledging that imports and exports are both very important. This was the beginning of the Korean economic miracle. It demonstrated to the world that prosperity can be reached through trade, and it demonstrated that in the 50 years since, that trade is indeed a handmaiden of growth, and that Korea's example is an example for other countries in the developing world. Now, I specialize in economic history to some extent, but I've always recognized the truth of what Hugh Patrick, a famous American economist who specialized in Asia, always said, which is the past is important, but the future is more important. And therefore the question is, will trade continue to be a handmaiden for progress? And unfortunately, there's some dark signs on the horizon. The WTO just last month announced that it was downgrading its forecast for the growth of world trade next year to 1.7%. From 2.8%, a whole percentage point lower, and it was also shaving down its expectation for the growth of trade in 2017. So these are disturbing signs and show that there's going to be headwind for the growth of trade and the world economy in the years to come. So the question is, why? First of all, let me just show you that we have had this slowdown in trade. This is world trade as a share of world gross domestic product. And what this chart very much shows is that there's a very special period between 1985 and 2005, a 20-year span, which you can see in the picture, where trade as a share of GDP, world GDP, grew very rapidly. But since the financial crisis, things have been much slower, and things have tailed off. So that raises the question, why, and what can we possibly do about it? So there are four main hypotheses that I think we can frame the discussion. One is the slowdown in trade simply reflects a slowdown in economic growth around the world, or that it demonstrates the end of trade liberalization, that major initiatives to open up markets have slowed, if not stopped. Third, maybe that global value chains are not quite the engine for growth as they have been over the past 20 years or so. And finally, the idea that there's growing protectionism. That's actually diminishing world trade growth. So let's consider each of these in turn, and this will sort of frame our discussion. First of all, regarding slower economic growth, the International Monetary Fund has calculated about 3/4, 75% of the world trade slowdown is due to slower growth in the world economy. So there's slower growth in China, which has had knockoff negative effects for emerging markets. The European Union economy has been suffering in recent years. And of course, U.S. economic growth has been sluggish since the financial crisis. Now, international trade is particularly sensitive to investment spending. And investment spending has been particularly low across these regions, particularly in the United States and Europe over the past few years. And that's had a negative impact on world trade because the IMF has found that capital goods, trade in capital goods and trade in investment goods and in intermediate products has slowed particularly strongly over the past few years. So there's certainly something to the fact that the slowdown in trade simply reflects the slowdown in world demand. But that's not all that is going on. And the next chart shows you this. This is a graph by decade of world growth in production, which is the light blue line, and world growth in total exports, which is the dark blue line. Now, it's been a historical fact since World War II that world trade has grown faster than world output. That's why the world trade to GDP ratio has been rising, usually by a percentage point or two, depending on the decade. There has been a slowdown in world production growth, and you can sort of see that over the past few decades. Trade growth has exceeded growth in production, but I do want to call your attention to one particular bar here. That is the 1990s. That is the outstanding decade here, where world exports grew much faster than world production. That is a standout period in terms of recent economic history. So what we have to ask is, the slowdown trade, yes, it's reflecting slowdown production, but is there something more going on? Was the 1990s an unusual period, and what do we see looking forward? Well, when we look at the last couple of years, we do see a different pattern. Once again, the second set of bars there is the 1986 to 2000 period, where once again trade growth vastly exceeded production growth. But in 2012, 2013, 2014, we saw basically trade growth and output growth at the same rate, if not a reversal of historical trend where trade is growing slower than production. So that implies there really is something different about the recent period. And here we also, and the way economists sort of look at this or consider this is try to consider what is the elasticity of trade growth with respect to output growth. So for a given increase in world GDP, how much would we expect world trade to grow? And you can estimate this over different times, countries, commodities, and what have you. And once again, what you see here is that elasticity was greater than 2 in the 1986 to 2000 period, higher than the historical norm from the 1950s to the 70s, or the 70 to 85 period depicted here. And the 2001 to 2013 period is actually a return to normality in some sense. We're coming down from the rapid growth we experienced in the late 1980s and the 1990s into the early 2000s. So that would be good news in some sense, that there's nothing abnormal, but we're just returning to trend. But I don't think we can quite reach that conclusion yet. But I do think we have to ask, well, if we can't expect this elasticity of 2, the high growth rate of trade relative to production, to continue, what was it that made that 1985 to 2005 period so special? Indeed, I would assert that this is a very unique period in world economic history. It's a 20-year period that was sort of a golden age for world trade. And I think it was driven by tremendous trade liberalization around the world, a tremendous reduction in trade barriers. And here are just some of the few elements to that. Number one I would put on the list is unilateral trade liberalization, unilateral trade openings on the part of China in the late 1970s, obviously continuing on thereafter. India in 1991, Vietnam in 1988, Mexico joining the GATT and the WTO, certainly the GATT in 1986, and undertaking unilateral reforms. Many emerging markets, many developing countries that had not participated in earlier GATT rounds were opening up their markets and lead to a tremendous increase in world trade. Now, just as central bankers speak of a zero lower bound in terms of interest rates, you can only do that once. You can only have a big liberalization once. There's a limit to how far you can push down those trade barriers. You can continue, of course, with bilateral FTAs. That's continued in the case of the United States. Regional trade arrangements, not all of which are perfect or stimulate trade a lot, but certainly NAFTA did a lot to integrate the North American market and led to a boom in cross-North American trade. And of course, we cannot ignore the WTO. The Uruguay round was a huge, enormous achievement. Its benefits were phased in from 1995 to 2005, with 2005, of course, being the expiration of the multi-fiber arrangement, which led to a tremendous growth in world trade in apparel goods and textile products. So once again, this was a unique period in world economic history, this 20-year period when we had tremendous opening of markets and tremendous expansion of international trade. It was precisely that trade liberalization that enabled global value chains to emerge. And we've seen this across different regions of the world, certainly here in the Asia-Pacific, where China's been a major force, certainly in the North American continent, where NAFTA was a major force for trade between the 3 countries in North America. But once again, this was dependent upon liberalization of trade. There are questions about whether that can be sustained going forward, and if global value chains were responsible for tremendous expansion in trade, can those global value chains be pushed even further to continue that high rate of growth? And there are reasons to think that that is not going to be the case. So, for example, let's look at the foreign content in China's exports. Of course, China is the great participant in these global value chains. In the United States, we commonly speak about the iPhone and the iPad as being a product made in the world, assembled in China, but made from components all over the world that cross borders many different times. Well, the growth in world trade in the early 1990s is explained a lot by China being a processing economy, pulling in a lot of intermediate components from the rest of the world, sending those to other countries. But the foreign content in China's exports has actually been falling since the mid-1990s, which implies to some extent there's a change in China's trade pattern and a reorientation of these global value chains. That intermediate goods are now being produced in China, and China's exports are now not encompassing foreign-made intermediate products, but they have been domesticated. They've sort of been swallowing up their supply chains in some sense. Now, there's a big debate about what is driving this. It could be a desire of policymakers to push domestic production of these intermediate goods at home. It could be a desire on the part of firms to reduce their costs by serving their customers through more localization policies. It could be that wage rates in Asia have been rising so rapidly that the extent of outsourcing has been diminished. There could be many factors behind this. But it's not evident, not just in this picture here, but also China's share of imports of parts and components and its exports of merchandise goods has also been trailing down since the 1990s. This is true not just in China and the Asia Pacific, but to a lesser extent in North America. So it could be driven by technology, could be driven by policy, could be driven by firm location choice. A lot of factors are behind this, but something I think we have to take into account. And also, we can't count on those global value chains reinvigorating world trade to the extent that they are dependent upon further liberalization. The last factor, another factor, is, of course, protectionism. This is something that my colleague Simon Evenet will speak more about, I'm sure, because he's one of the experts in this area. But the issue has become not so much the old protectionism of the 1980s, 90s, and even 2000 to some extent. That is anti-dumping and countervailing duties, which harass trade. It's not even the voluntary export restraints that we saw proliferate in the 1970s and 80s, which were de facto abolished, or de jure abolished in the Uruguay round. But there are a lot of other things going on. There's increasing regulatory measures that adversely affect foreign providers as opposed to domestic providers. There are domestic subsidies, which are propping up capacity and helping out domestic producers at the expense of foreign producers. And so, as Simon and his colleagues have documented, there have been a sharp uptick in reported measures, discriminatory measures, affecting international trade, certainly after the crisis, but more particularly since 2012 or so. And that's a particularly worrisome development because one can understand the growth of protectionism after the financial crisis, but why it continues to percolate is a source of concern. And of course, measuring the impact of these things is A, difficult, but B, measuring their impact is also very difficult because they tend to be discriminatory on a product-by-product basis. It's very difficult to quantify the impact of these non-tariff barriers. But just to show how the world has changed, just a few hours ago, Simon tweeted out a report from the OECD, released, I believe, today, on protectionism. And I was able to download the slides from the OECD and present them right here. All happened in the last just a few minutes. So on the right-hand side, these are yet another measure of trade-distorting measures, trade restrictions rising in G20 countries. The whole OECD report is focused on the reasons for the slowdown in trade, which you see on the left-hand side panel, why it's way below trend, trying to explain that, perhaps, by the rise in trade restrictions. So that's certainly something that's gotten the attention of the OECD, as well as Simon and his colleagues. And as I mentioned, these measures, as Simon has identified, are very different from the ones in the past. They're not necessarily border measures. They can be behind the border non-tariff barriers such as regulatory restrictions, and increasingly about a quarter of them are bailouts or subsidies, which once again one could understand in the aftermath of the financial crisis, but why we are still seeing this and dealing with it 5 or 6 years after the financial crisis, I think is a cause for concern. So, and the problem, of course, with these subsidies is they build up a defensive reaction on other states. So if one country props up capacity, other countries are more likely to use anti-dumping or countervailing duties against those subsidies or want to enact their own subsidies to protect their domestic producers from those trade distortions. Once again, not a classic trade barrier, but certainly something that's interfering with the flow in international commerce. How does this impact Korea? Let me just say a few words in conclusion about that. So here's the contribution of exports to GDP growth in Korea. And usually it's fairly substantial. Obviously not most important source of growth in GDP is domestic investment, domestic demand, but exports have played an important role over the past 50 years or so. But if we look at since 2012, 2013, 2014, exports have played a much smaller role in promoting and keeping up growth in Korea. Now, Korea's been through some difficult times in terms of the world trade environment in the past, when exports have not been a major factor behind economic growth. I think particularly of the early 1980s, where there's a major world recession, debt crisis, and protectionism in the Western world. Korea survived that. Korea will do well, but I think it's incumbent upon Korean policymakers to consider going forward, if you're facing these headwinds from the international market, can you rely on exports as supporting growth as you had in the past? And here's just the annual rate of export growth in Korea since 2010, much lower since we've seen since the early 1990s. It could be very much that not just Korea, but many countries are in a different world where trade is not going to be the handmaiden of growth quite the way it was in the past. So let me conclude with just making a couple of observations. First of all, we do have to put the slowdown trade in context. It has been a difficult period for the world economy, but in some sense, some slowdown was inevitable. I would argue that the period from 1985 to 2005 was a unique period in the world economy, where we had a confluence of effects in terms of greater trade liberalization, growth of global value chains that propelled world trade growth to rates that we had not seen in previous generations. As an economic historian, I've gone back to the late 19th century. There's a great boom in globalization in the late 19th century with capital flows, migration of people, and trade flows. But this period that we've seen more recently far exceeds that, I think, in terms of its economic impact. But that's not something that can be replicated decade after decade. It's hard, in my view, to see that we're going to see rapid growth in world trade in coming decades. All the factors, I think, that I've listed before will be contributing, and we can debate about which ones are going to be more important. Hopefully, it's not going to be greater protectionism. But there were some special one-off effects that came about as a result of the events that we saw in the 1980s, 90s, and early 2000s. I think the big question we're facing is, with this slower growth in trade and perhaps slower growth in GDP, will that lead to more or less protectionism? And one can see one of two things happening. Slower growth in imports, I think, relieves pressure on domestic producers. And there may be fewer demands for protectionism because they're not facing the threat of import competition. In the United States, there's much economic research recently about what's called the China shock. The tremendous expansion in U.S. imports from China between 1995 and 2005. And just now are we seeing some of the impact of that, and in fact, it may even have an impact on the presidential election just held. But it didn't lead to, hopefully that will not lead to greater protectionism. We didn't see so much during that China shock period. We saw some. But there is this question about the relationship between the growth in imports and whether that leads to defensive measures. So slower growth might lead to less protectionism to the extent that there's less pressure on import competing industries. It could lead to more protectionism because in the search for growth and the quest for growth, domestic firms will try to snatch that away from foreign firms. And of course, the biggest uncertainty overhanging the entire world economic outlook in terms of trade is the worries about U.S. trade leadership, which I'm sure will be a big topic of discussion here, given the outcome of the recent presidential election. I won't say too much on that because I'll leave that to the panel, and I'm willing to chip in there as well. I guess I'll just close with two comments. One is, at least in the United States, one will often see newspaper headlines or online discussion about the end of globalization because of the slowdown in trade, the rise in protectionist talk, at least, if not measures. I believe this is complete hyperbole. Globalization is not ending. Globalization is not going in reverse. Globalization may have topped off for the time being in terms of what it can achieve in terms of further growth and expansion, but I don't see a major reversal. I don't see Brexit as a major reversal of globalization. There, the concerns were mainly about labor migration. And I'm even optimistic about the United States, which leads me to my second point, that there's a lot of talk as well, even here this morning, about the loss of public sentiment in terms of favorability of trade, and the election may show that. I don't take that. I don't believe that, because if you look at public opinion polls, which stretch back for about 2 decades now, asking the same question to the American public, do you believe that world trade is a source of opportunity for the United States or a threat to the United States? There was a period in the mid-2000s, about 2003, 4, 5, where more people said threat than opportunity. But since the financial crisis, by a fairly wide margin, about 58% to 33%, said that world trade is an opportunity for the United States. So despite the outcome of the election, despite the rhetoric that came out of that campaign, the American public, I believe, is much more open to keeping markets open than many of the politicians say. The one caveat I would make is that sometimes political parties are slow to pick up on that and represent certain special interests that may not share that view. Traditionally, it's been the Democratic Party that was in favor of more import restrictions, and the Republicans that were more in favor of open markets and trade agreements. That may be shifting, because now with President-elect Trump, the Republican support for trade openness has deteriorated. Most of the American public that is in favor of open trade tend to be Democrats. We have yet to see the Democratic Party, however, move back from its position in recent decades and embrace a more open trade framework. But I'm hopeful that that will happen, because ultimately the parties are responsible to the electorate. And I would just say once again, the American electorate is largely in favor of international trade, and I hope you can keep that in mind. Thank you very much for your attention. I appreciate the opportunity to be here.